This is Steven Sargeant. This is Around the Coin podcast. And if you like fintech and content, this is going to be a really cool episode. We have the head of content for Europe for Money 2020, the largest fintech conference probably around the world. He talks a lot about his early days working in wealth management and how he transferred a lot of that knowledge along with his journalistic knowledge of interviewing Rafael Nadal, Djokovic, all of these amazing tennis players and bands, and how he used all that information to help create content for Money 2020's conference. He talks a lot about the conference and the challenges and the benefits of the conference. And he goes into his new book, Why DeFi Matters. And he explains it to us, why it matters, what are some of the challenges, the dichotomy that we're fighting with each end of the spectrum of how do we implement this technology in everyday life. We talk a little bit about, things like the Metaverse and NFTs, but we get deep into DeFi technology and what are some things holding us back and what are some things propelling the industry, like the way and the role that crypto is playing on the elections, not just in the US, but around the world. This is a fun podcast. Ian has such a fun personality, and I know you're going to enjoy this one. This is your host, Steven Sargeant. We have a special guest on the Around the Coin podcast, live from Money 2020, or at least live from within the organization of Money 2020, and an established author, Ian Horne. Give us a little bit of your background, Ian, and now I'm going to jump in. I'm going to dive into some of your background, and we're going to go deep on some questions about Money 2020 and your book, Why DeFi Matters.
Hey, Stephen. First, good to join you here on the podcast. My background is a bit confusing because obviously you mentioned the book, Why DeFi Matters, which is going to be mostly what we're talking about, but I also run content in Europe for Money 2020, major fintech, banking and payments show. I, like many people who are in financial services, kind of fell into it. So 10 years ago, I saw a job advertised on Facebook by a friend for a company called Citywire. They were looking for someone to head up their networking team for financial advisors and later wealth managers. And I kind of thought, well, that's a chance to travel around the UK and drink coffee and go for beers with people and things like that. And thus sparked a 10-year career in finance where I ended up speaking to investors about how they, asset allocate and how they look after their wealthiest clients and so on. My career, though, I think one thing we're going to get into, right, is to start at the very beginning. I was a journalist. So I used to write about the tennis tour, a job I kind of fell into. I was looking for a way to make extra money while I was at university, to be honest, and I was taking on any writing commission I could get. A friend of mine, it turned out, was writing for a website called livetennis.com. And he got me a job after I got published several places elsewhere. And this ended up being a 4 or 5 year kind of part-time and then full-time role where I would write previews about matches. I mean, they were very cursory previews. It wasn't great writing, but it was comprehensive. And I also got to go to some of the major events. So I had some crazy times at the French Open, for instance, where I got to interview a lot of the players, be in press conferences with like.
What year was this? I'm going to interrupt you a lot because I know you're going to try.
Yeah.
Like, what year was this? Like, who's in the finals of this year? Like, who are the stars you're talking to? Set the scene for us. Is it like Steffi Graf or not that early? Not that early on.
Oh, no, not that early on, no. But the Roland Garros I'm thinking of, and I feel terrible for actually forgetting the women's side of the draw here. But what I do remember is there was an incredible 5-set match in the semi-finals between Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal. I think it was 13 or 14, where Djokovic missed a really kind of straightforward-looking overhead smash, I think in the 4th set, which ended up kind of counting against him at the end. And then when it got to the final, it was David Ferrer against Nadal, and that was done in about an hour and a half, and it wasn't very difficult for Rafa. But it was a hell of a year, though. I mean, going at the tennis tour at that time, you had incredible talent. I mean, I actually forgot who won the women's tournament, which embarrasses me. But I mean, you had the likes of Serena Williams and Maria Sharapova there. Venus Williams was there, I think. Just an incredible amount of talent on show. But yeah, the men's tour was seriously hot. I mean, people talk about the big four in men's tennis of Djokovic, Nadal, Federer, and Murray. They were all at the peak of their powers back then. In fact, I think Djokovic wasn't. He was just about getting to that level. But being able to watch
level set some of the interviews you had. I know it's probably you and a bunch of other reporters and journalists in a room, or maybe it was like one-on-one. Was there anything that you saw or noticed? You're like, oh, the way this person carries themselves, I can see why they're a winner or why they're successful. Especially as you did previews of maybe not other people ranked as high as like the Joker or a Rafa.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think people who are right at the top of the game, they do have that aura about them, but partly it's because you know who they are, right? I think they're not necessarily doing it to make you feel distant from them. I think what I did find is there's so many different personalities, and that kind of surface level personality doesn't necessarily tell you who's going to be successful or not. But the ones that succeeded were the players that were consistently dedicated over a long period of time and disciplined and serious with what they do. And obviously they have that underlying talent as well. And perhaps a bit of luck by staying injury free, or having the right kind of support and foundations when they're younger and things like that. But actually, you saw so many different people and personality types. So Federer, for instance, classy guy. I just remember asking him a question. It was the first time I'd ever asked him a question in a press conference, and it was a really just basic, generic question. And he was like, "Oh, that's a great question," and he answered it really
Oh, he gave
nicely.
you one of those. That's a great question. When it was
He
like,
did. I mean, I think I might have just given you one of them, Stephen. So let's be nice about those. Anyway,
there's nothing better. There's nothing better when someone says that. It's like the classic response to make the other person feel amazing.
But what was telling about that, there was a journalist sat next to me that was working for one of the UK broadsheet newspapers, and basically said to me, he'll have recognized that you're new, and he does that. He always wants journalists to feel like welcome. So you have someone like that who's very at ease, very calm. Then compare him with like Rafael Nadal, who felt very on edge the whole time, felt permanently uncomfortable. Speaking to me, he seems very uncomfortable in a press conference. It's not to say that he is. He just doesn't sit still very well. He's very agitated. You see him on the court. Every water bottle had to be in the right place. I still remember one of his opponents, I think during that tournament, deliberately moving one of his water bottles to try and get in his head, and failed, because you don't really get in Rafa Nadal's head that easy. But it was so interesting to see the kind of calm of Federer. Then you've got the kind of frantic energy of Nadal. And then again, you've got someone like Djokovic, who at the time was actually quite humorous in his press conferences and was still trying to make people laugh. And I think the public didn't take to that persona. And then you've now got the half man, half machine Djokovic that you see in front of you today. So, and again, I mean, all the players had very different approaches and different kind of behavior types. I think the thing that really sets people apart is that time, that energy, that dedication. So that's it really. It's a long slog.
And then you get into finance, which is interesting. You were the head of UK audience development. Can you explain a little bit at CityWire? Like, that sounds a lot. That sounds like you're working for a broadcast channel, not someone heavily invested in financial matters. Break us down. Is that the only role that has that title in the world, or is that quite common in
it's
the
not that common
industry?
No, it's a strangely unappreciated role, I think. I mean, I did that job for 8 years, first an executive, then I ran the team for several years. The interesting thing I think about audience development is many event companies don't think to have a team that does that. Money 2020 doesn't have a team that does that for one reason or another. But what it really is it's a team that spends its time getting to know the audience, engaging with them, writing content about them, doing podcasts with them, heading to their offices, meeting them and the team, doing various things to basically champion the industry that you're in and the people within it. And the idea is if you build that rapport and those relationships, they will then turn up to your events and engage with your publications. They'll do, various things. And it's kind of a nice job to have, because you are there to literally introduce people to what you do. And it's kind of like a marketing function. It's kind of an editorial function. It's kind of a sales function. It's all sorts of things. And it can seem like a really odd job. I mean, depending on who I'd speak to, I'd tell someone I was a journalist. I'd tell someone else I was a professional coffee drinker. I would say different things to different people, to be honest. But what was great about that was we were working with an audience of professional investors. That market is only a certain size. You can't just pluck investors out of thin air. You have to go out into the industry and meet these people, engage with them, get to know them, listen to their interests as well. Like, listen to them talk about your product and how you can serve them better. And if you can do that and then prove that value, they're going to engage with what you do. So it's a fun job. It was a really, really fun job. But actually, audience development as a function is seriously underappreciated and it's not spoken about very often. For me, it was a
Sounds
great
like what I do on LinkedIn. It's
exactly
underappreciated.
that.
You're doing 18 different functions. You just described an entrepreneur, basically.
Yeah, well, exactly that. Yeah, you've got to tell people like why your thing is good. Listen to them on what they want you to do more of or less of, and all the rest. It's a cool job, and doing that for 8 years gave me a real insight into financial advice and then wealth management as well. And funnily enough, that is the kind of origin story for what I do now, because the UK financial advice and wealth management market is an interesting one. There's some brilliant people there. I had lots of good relationships with people there and enjoyed it. But I did find as I got to know people in their businesses that technology was a bit of an afterthought. Not for any kind of malicious reason, but more perhaps, finance is often a relationships-based industry. So people's value, they kind of see in learned knowledge or having that conversation with clients and all that kind of stuff, listening to them help them get their outcomes, or managing an investment portfolio, which doesn't have to be done in a high-tech way. But there were so many efficiencies being missed out on that I kind of petitioned to write my own newsletter and have my own podcast on wealth technology or wealth tech.
Right.
Management relented and let me do it, which was fantastic. I then launched a series of events, like virtual events and then in-person event as well. I mean, speaking of being an entrepreneur, I was the salesperson for that event. I was the host of that event. I was running the content for that.
You were like running the mic. You were taking registration.
Seriously. And I had some very helpful people working with me, but I was definitely I was going above and beyond to make that work. So I was just passionate about it, And from there, I think I realized that I was so enthused by how technology was improving wealth management and financial advice that the next logical step seemed to be to actually jump fully into fintech. And I then applied to work for Money 2020 on the content side of things. And yeah, here I am now.
Was that like a dream job for you? You have to think Money 2020 content. That's like, for me, it's like, wow, like you have to work for a big organization, no shortage of funds, whether it's sponsors or what they're doing, spending money on production, and you get to focus on just the content. Was that kind of like a dream job, or was there a lot of functions? Because there are a lot of conferences out there, but very few are even close to as big as Money 2020.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really sweet job to have, right? I mean, we get to do some really cool things, and funnily enough, my first experience of the show was the Vegas show in 2022. My first week at the job was Vegas, and I mean, what a way to start a job, right? I really can't think of a bigger shock to the senses in our industry than turning up. You're in Las Vegas. I can't remember how many thousand people, but about 12,000, I think, off the top of my head, all there, all with a kind of mutual interest in fintech. And yeah, there is an element where that is a complete blast. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like any job, there's things there's plenty of spreadsheets involved. There's lots of admin involved. There's lots of chasing up people for various things and briefings and all the rest.
Being
of
sent
course,
in like 8 hours after they were supposed to.
well, we don't talk about those, but but yeah, of course, yeah, we do have that. Yeah, speakers that are late at their deadlines and all sorts of other things like that, or last minute delays where someone has to cancel like the day before they're due to speak and stuff like that. You're always going to get that stuff, but no, you're right. It's a hell of a job to have, and there's a bit of pressure with it. Don't get me wrong, because like the industry really cares about this show, right? And if the content sucks, I'm going to be the first to hear about that. Well, I might be the first, but I'll be one of the first to hear about that, right? And at the same time, I don't really think about it like that, because it is just very fun, and getting to like help set the agenda and get the kind of best thoughts and ideas of leading companies in this space is a cool thing.
And if the content sucks, it goes from a fintech conference to a crypto conference. How do you take, like, you're talking about the scrappiness of running your own events and building the audience. How do you leverage those skills when you have such a massive undertaking like Money 2020? Is there still some of that hand-to-hand unscalable things that you can do at such a massive organization to make people, the audience members, the vendors, and make them still feel like, oh, I'm talking to Ian, and Ian, what are we going to do on the main stage? How do you keep that kind of closeness and essence while running such a huge operation?
Well, that's the thing. So with the focus being on content, for me, we do brief every speaker that comes across our stages, on guidelines of what we think would work, what might not work. We listen to them on their ideas for their session. And it gets to the point where you start to know most of the sessions on the stages quite intimately, which is kind of strange. I have unusual evenings in like the weeks before the show where I'll wake up at 4 a.m. thinking about a session, which is just I don't recommend that to anyone. Yes, I'm probably a total nerd. That's okay. But it's definitely part of the whole process. There are other things as well. Like, we get to know people. I do go to other fintech events across mostly the UK, but also Europe too, where I can. And you get to know people, and it is a personal thing. So I don't think there's ever, as much as we run a massive show, I don't think we lose that personal element of working with the speakers and making sure that experience is good for them as much as it can be. And don't get me wrong, there's anything in excess of 300, in some years more than 400 speakers. So it can't be
Wow.
fully hand-holding, but I think you lose something if you lose that element of being reachable and contactable and being able to discuss ideas with someone. So yeah, we do our best to keep that.
How do you, you're talking about wealth technology, financial technology. That's what the essence of the conference is. How do you make sure that you're capturing the future of, the industry without just chasing the hype, but also, keeping some of the existing content that's important today? You have such a wide group, right? At 300
Mhm.
people, you can manage exactly what they're looking for. Almost 3,000 people within a minute coming into a stage. Like, you have over 12,000, I believe, people. Like, that's hard to like make sure everyone has a track that suits them. How do you manage that from a content lens?
Yeah, we do all sorts of things. So in the run up to the show, we hold all sorts of research calls with banks, payment providers, fintechs. Everything from startups through to major institutions. So we try and understand what's coming up in the year ahead and how we can best capture those trends. We also do things like we taxonomize the content. So behind the scenes, there are all sorts of things that I'm looking at to make sure that anyone that attends our show is going to see enough content that's suitable for them. So, we've got a wide audience. We've got people who are in the crypto space. We've got people who are in cybersecurity. We've got payment providers. We've got people in credit and lending. I need to make sure that we have enough stuff that services those needs. So we do that. We audit that quite closely. In terms of the quality of the content and, distinguishing between hype and nonsense, yeah. So one thing we do is we try and coach people a bit on applications. So we make videos with people or for people, and we sometimes turn up at industry like kind of broadcasts to explain how people can apply to the show, give them hints
Right.
and tips on how to do that. And also, I think one of the key things is we genuinely want like applied uses of technology. So when it comes to something like, say, AI, like I don't necessarily want people to come and say, AI is good or AI is bad or whatever, unless there's a really, really good reason for them to say that. Like, okay, if you're like Sam Altman, tell me about the ethics of AI. That's cool. I'm interested in that. But generally speaking, unless you're going to show me like how AI is materially changing financial services, I'm not necessarily here for it. Same with crypto. I mean, there's loads. I mean, there's so many chances in crypto, which I don't. I'm not trying to paint the whole industry with one brush there because
Right.
I try and be as balanced as I can. But you can tell the difference between someone talking about a genuine solution in the market versus someone that's just saying, "Oh, crypto is good. There's loads of hype. The prices are up." Like,
Right. Right.
so I
Please,
think,
please invest in my course after I get off
yeah,
stage.
yeah, exactly that. So I think, yeah, no one has a perfect kind of bullshit filter. I don't either, but at the same time, we are looking for people to demonstrate how and why what they do actually improves things. And then beyond that, I mean, I work on content with Mickey Tesfaye, who actually is based out in America. Some of you guys might have met him listening to this podcast. He's a former analyst and journalist. I have worked in journalistic functions. We both have that kind of training, and you can't do that kind of role without having to, you come across a fair amount of people that
Right.
talk nonsense without any substance, right? And I think it's something we're very careful about. And there are a million and one things we do to kind of make sure that we don't have chances on the stage, because it's important, right? If you come to Money 2020, you want great content, and
Right.
yeah, we do what we can to make sure that you don't get someone just plugging or shilling or whatever.
Speaking of crypto, there was this, huge thing, whether it was crypto kind of AI, where, some of these crypto conferences were using AI women to show that they have all these women speakers. And then
Mhm.
it comes out like, the person who was, oh, it was a placeholder, nothing malicious. How do you balance that diversity with like, hey, we want the qualified speakers. We know we have qualified speakers, but like, hey, there's this panel, like, I'm part of Unmantle, the panel with the Association for
Yeah.
Women in Crypto. So I will never speak on a panel anymore anyway that doesn't have a woman, and they have a list of like probably 100 women that could easily fill all around the world. Do you think about diversity, or is it just like by the nature of you guys speaking with it, your team, the constituents look much like the speakers? How is that? Is that an app? Like, is it something purposeful? Do you guys have meetings about it? You don't have to go into nitty gritty details, but like, how do you think about diversity altogether?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's massively important to have that on the stages, and we do, generally speaking, at Money 2020 across all the shows have, I would say, better ratios for gender and ethnic equality than pretty much any finance show going. I'd put ourselves up there against anyone. But we aim for 50-50 in terms of gender split, by the way, as best as we can. The reality is it often ends up being slightly less than that for various reasons, like late dropouts and so on. Firstly, that crypto story you mentioned, I was so baffled when I saw that, because I just like you said, there are easy ways to find women that can talk on the topic. It's not like there are no women in blockchain or crypto
Right.
or Web3. Like it's lazy and it's bizarre, and I don't know at what point they intended to reveal that there were no actual women there. I can't. Yeah, that was a bizarre
I'm
game.
assume once they cash the checks after the conference would be the best time for
Yeah,
them.
well, yeah, that must have been it. But it's a strange bit of catfishing and a very easily audited one.
And
So
what's funny is they just weren't doing it to say, hey, look at our women speakers. They knew a lot of those sponsors wanted more diversity. And that was kind of their method. It wasn't like, hey, look we have speakers and they're women. It was more like the sponsors like, hey, let me take a look at your speaker list kind of thing. And that's, I think, where it came up as like, oh, this was very, very planned.
We'll just create some women. It's deeply insulting. I don't really understand what the rationale is. Like you say, there are places where there are people that are creating like areas where you can find good female speakers. As a content professional myself, it is easy enough to find them. You do have to speak to companies, and there is some back and forth sometimes, because we are in fintech, we are in finance. The majority of people in that industry are men, and they are senior figures are men. Sorry. And they're white men as well. So you have to push back sometimes when you're speaking to major brands that want to speak on stage. We always say to them, look, put forward a diverse agenda, put forward a diverse panel, because it will increase your likelihood of getting selected, because we want to have the best, most diverse conversation that we can have. And it's not about, box ticking. It's about having people represented on stage so the content has more depth to it, more richness to it. So yeah, we do a lot on that front. Speaking from a UK and European perspective, The Herd is a good website to check out. Chantal Swainston runs that. Great database of women that are brilliant at talking about finance and all things fintech. It's not like these resources aren't out there. So
Right.
I think in this day and age, there's no excuse. I think if you're a marketing and comms professional trying to get your message out on stage, the sensible thing to do here is to put forward your best and strongest female speakers that you've got as well, because our applications represent our audience a bit. We get far more applications from men than we do from women, and so on.
Men are like, what? Open to speak?
Yeah,
sure,
exactly.
I'll talk about any topic.
I don't think I've ever turned down a speaking gig.
The ones that apply, they're like,
but yeah, I kind of, that's it, isn't it? I mean, I don't think there are many men out there that are hesitant to speak on topics when they're invited, and that kind of becomes a problem. But anyway, yeah, to your point, we really do care about that, and we put a lot of thought and effort into that. It requires some pushback. It also requires people to buy into it as well, but I think people increasingly do. So yeah, that kind of AI nonsense, my goodness, I don't know what that. If you're gonna pull a scam as well, at least pull a good scam. I mean, geez.
Yeah, I think the fact that you created an AI person like kind of adds a little salt to the wounds.
Yeah,
Talk to me about Money 2020 though. Like one common theme I've been thinking about. We're gonna go into your book. I want to hear hey, give some exclusive stuff about what to expect for Money 2020. But before that, we see a lot of side events popping up at these massive conferences.
Yeah.
People not say no longer want to, but they're like, hey, how can we maximize every dollar? Hey, I may not want to sponsor a booth, but hey, I'll sponsor 100 drinks, during lunch on a side event. I've been noticing some conferences are having now official side events, which makes companies want to, make that list and still get the distribution of the conference. Talk to me. This must be a little bit of a gray area and kind of yeah, it's fine, but kind of that's not what the point is. Without the conference, you won't have any side events. So let's continue to support the conference. Give me your landscape of this.
Yeah, well, the thing with parasites is, I'm kidding. You're right. It's a grey area, isn't it? And I think you have to take the rough with the smooth. Really, is my proper answer. And actually, we do advertise certain fringe events on our app when people show up, because we accept it's part of running an event. It's going to happen, and as well, there's a learning exercise too. As well, if I see something on the fringe content that I think actually that's really good and I wish we'd done that, there's a learning experience there.
Right.
And there might be something that we can bring in. I mean, my aim is to make sure everything we run inside the show is so good that the fringe event isn't worth looking at. But you never know. I think you can't really do too much to stop it. And I say that because, we run our shows in Vegas, Amsterdam, and Bangkok. You can't buy a city. You can't shut down a city and stop people doing stuff. And there's something that's encouraging about the fact that everyone is coming to town when we're in town. So I suppose you also take that as an endorsement of we're doing something right and we're bringing people to the city. I think the challenge for us is just to make sure that the best stuff is always, as I say, it's in the tent, it's in the show.
Right.
And, and if you want to turn up and you can't afford or don't want to be in the main thing, fine. But when you do take that dive and jump in and become part of the regular show, then you realize that's the full experience. That's the best experience that you've got. So, I don't, I can joke about this stuff. Yes, it's a confusing situation. I don't think it's going to go away, but yeah, I think people that commit to the actual full experience will realize that it's worth just being part of it. We run an awesome show.
Like, it's like a sporting event. Like, yeah, you could watch conveniently for free, drink as many beers from your own home, or you could be in the stands. It's like, for the most part, when when this if it's the World Series and it's only happening once a year, and somehow you can get tickets, like, you go watch it in the stands. There's an energy there that you can't replicate, outside or at a local bar watching it on TV. And I think that's the most important thing. What can we expect? Money 2020 Money 2020 in 2025 is coming. Yeah. I believe it's June in Amsterdam. Talk to me about the location. Is this like, why Amsterdam, and why haven't you gone to any other places? Or is this kind of your staple? Are you locked in maybe with a deal with the event?
Oh, there are a million and one reasons why. I'll admit I've been at the company 2 years and wasn't involved in the original discussion to bring the show to Amsterdam. You'd need to speak to likely the CEO, but I know there was a connection with Dutch fintech doing a lot of work to bring us in. Same with the Dutch royal family being part of that whole bid to kind of attract Money 2020 to the area. So, and we had Prince Constantine speak at the show this year, which was awesome. I mean, the Rai in Amsterdam it's a great venue. It's very spacious. It's well connected. There are logistics reasons as well as the fact that it's a really good area to run a show. And as being on mainland Europe is actually pretty handy too. So I know previously to that it was in Copenhagen. I don't know of any plans to move it, but that would not be the head of content's decision, I have to say. But so long as they give me enough space to put some cool stages in, I'm
some
golden.
Pyro, some fireworks, anything that you're expecting, anything that you can, even if it doesn't happen, anything that you're like, hey, what would really be cool next year would be AVRC. Anything that you can think of that you think that's maybe not on the list, so you're not spoiling it internally.
Yeah,
your comms team is like listening intently to this podcast.
Yeah, I think a few people would squirm if I went into any detail, and we're still kind of at the ideation phase. Right. So I'm kind of toying around with some ideas at the moment, Stephen, of how we can bring people in and different content themes we can trial. I genuinely can't say anything anymore, but
I love it. Hey, man, this is a podcast. We're gonna put.
Yeah.
We're gonna push. So. Now, at the end of last year, you do what most crazy people would do. You release a book. You lock yourself away and you write why DeFi matters. And, maybe I can just ask you right away, why does DeFi matter? And why did you feel the need to, put everything pen to paper to show the people why DeFi mattered?
That's a good question. So, I mean, the inspiration for this book actually goes all the way back to me being a relationship manager in financial services, for investors, because I always saw coverage of crypto as being really, really contentious. And I say crypto rather than DeFi. There's obviously a distinction, but people either hated this stuff or they loved it. And then also speaking to professional investors, they often publicly say, don't invest in this stuff. And then you speak to them at an event or you speak to them in their office and they own some Bitcoin or they own some Ether or they own whatever.
They pull up their MetaMask on their phone and you're like,
exactly that.
You have dog with hat.
yeah, exactly. Oh God, it was pre-dog with hat, but like it's not even a hypocritical position to hold, by the way. I mean, if you work in the financial services industry and you're investing on behalf of clients, until the arrival of like ETFs, even then you probably wouldn't allocate a typical client in this stuff. Like investing your clients in crypto would be a regulatory disaster. And a lot of advisors and wealth managers were being asked by their clients, like, should I buy crypto? I've seen the money going and I've seen the prices going up. Like, why aren't you investing in me in all this stuff for me? And it possibly for them became an ongoing frustration of having unqualified investors telling them they should be investing in something that's unregulated. You can imagine the kind of irritation that caused. But anyway, to go back to why I wrote the book, I was also really interested in what was going on here and trying to understand it. And I honestly found it very hard to trust anything I read about crypto. I still do find it hard to trust a lot of what I read about crypto, because you've got some people that are obviously trying to sell you stuff and shill things, and crypto's the best. Oh yeah, next year Bitcoin is gonna be worth $1 million a coin and all that kind of stuff. And then you read another article and it's, this is a fraud, the whole thing's a Ponzi scheme. These guys are criminals. Oh yeah, this exchange collapsed, so the whole thing's a bust.
Correct.
And I just found it very hard to kind of understand what was going on. I thought, this is an interesting area. Like, what is really going on here? My original perspective was actually to go and write a book about what people should know about investing in cryptocurrency and like whether or not they were a legitimate asset and all the rest. I found there's a much better story actually just talking about decentralized finance more broadly, what it does, how it has changed finance, what it might mean for the future. So that kind of brings me back to your original question of why DeFi matters, obviously the title of the book. And I think it matters because people have introduced the idea of transactions or kind of entire financial ecosystems being carried out without the involvement of banks or intermediaries, which actually in itself is kind of crazy. Like, crazy is the wrong word, but it's different. It's new.
No, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Well,
It's
yes,
crazy.
yes and no. I mean, actually, do you know what I mean? You're right. Yes, it kind of is crazy. It kind of isn't crazy, but it's very different. And the impact of just throwing that into a world that has lots of regulated financial services is different, right? So if we go really extreme with why DeFi matters, it's the promise of an entirely new financial ecosystem. Make of that what you will. And to dial it back, and I prefer to dial it back, we can also look at how the technology is added to the existing financial system or is like starting to add to that system. When you look at doing things about intermediaries, what you're really doing is adding efficiencies and automating things, really. And that can have lots of different impacts. So it's a story of what we can upgrade and what we can add efficiencies to. And that might involve like international money movement. It might be, we look at decentralization, that might be involved identity, asset management, governance, if we look at DAOs and more. So, cryptocurrency is new types of money. It's also inspired central banks to create new types of money. You've got them CBDC pilot projects and actual product projects, which most of the world seems to be engaged with. I think it's like over 90% of the world's GDP has either been piloted, or nations with 90% plus of the world's GDP, I should say, have experimented with CBDCs.
Is that the Project Agora by the Bank of International Settlements or other projects?
No, what I'm looking at, and actually the best way to look into this is the Atlantic Council's CBDC tracker. So I would advise anyone to look at that. It's kind of their clever wording of it, but what they're trying to say is the nations that between them have 90% plus of GDP have all had some involvement with a CBDC project. They've either piloted one, researched one, or launched. So the point is this has inspired new money in a crypto sense, but you also have central banks across the world looking very seriously at integrating the technology of DeFi into their own central bank money, which is really quite something. And then, I mean, if you look at beyond that, like why DeFi matters, it's created social movements, collectives. I mean, look at the Bored Ape Yacht Club and things like that. It's inspired artwork, not all good. It's influencing politics. I think we'll get into that later. Economic policy. I mean, this is actually like crazy stuff. So yeah, I'll go back to my original point. It is crazy.
To us, me and you. I live in Canada. You live in the UK. You know, somebody scams our credit card. We can pick up the phone and call the bank, and they remove the charges. I understand why it might mean something for someone in Nigeria, where they can't just walk into a bank and get US dollars or to pay a vendor. And, even if, their money's being devalued by the second, so they have to kind of push it into stable coins to retain their wealth. Why do you think does it matter more for certain economies than it does for other? Or do you think broadly speaking, it matters and it's important for everyone to have access to an alternative financial ecosystem?
I think that's a really important question to ask. And I think it matters more to some people than it does to others. I think when we look at the impact of the crypto on money, what we often mistakenly talk about is this idea of replacing the traditional financial system. I don't think it does that. I think it adds depth to the financial system. It adds a new type of money, new types of purposes, new use cases. So what's useful for you or me might not be useful for someone else. If you want to be really kind of zoom out on it, how crypto could be very influential for us is if it helps sway the US election. That could actually have a very big impact on us, but that's not necessarily a specific DeFi use case. I mean, in the book, I pointed out some things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how Bitcoin was used to get money to the front lines in Ukraine and materially made a difference. That provided money for fuel, tanks, guns, armor, all that stuff. And without crypto, that might not have happened as quickly as it did.
Or at all, right? The
Mm,
centralized platforms like GoFundMe refused to send funds there because it was for military action. We even saw
yeah,
in Canada the Freedom Convoy. You could not donate, to fight something that legally the people had the right to fight the government on. So government started knocking the door on every crypto exchange in Canada, some even decentralized exchanges,
yeah,
and that
yeah.
they probably weren't aware of how the technology worked.
Well, that's the funny thing, isn't it? And I think DeFi becomes useful to you when your system doesn't work for you.
Right.
And sometimes it might not currently have a use to you, but it might have a latent use if the world changes, if your world changes. It might offer some kind of financial inclusion aspect if you're shut out of the financial system. If you're, other examples I remember pointing out in the book were there are women in Afghanistan using it to have access to money because they can't open a bank account. Again, in the developed world, I think the primary use case, honestly, is it's an investment, just maybe a bit of fun. I'm not saying that's the only use case for it, but I think for your typical financial professional, it's something to play around with. But that doesn't mean that's the whole point of it. So who knows? Who knows like how that evolves through time? But I think when you think about why DeFi matters, it's always about like try and decenter yourself. Like it's not just about you. There are millions of people in this world with different perspectives, different, you know, backgrounds. You might live in a country that's suffering from hyperinflation, for instance.
Right.
And if you can find a way to effectively store and hold, and spend Bitcoin and so on, that might be preferable to holding your own government's currency. At the same time, that might do further things to devalue your government's currency, which then might have some impact on you. But it's got to the point where you've got like I think the cryptocurrency market is worth over $2 trillion. It's quite small in terms of related to general world GDP, and at the same time, like it's not insignificant. So yeah, the use cases are niche. Yes, the use cases are often illegal, but even then, there's a question of whose laws and who are you? Like,
Exactly. Yeah, illegal where, right? To take money
yeah,
out of your own country into USD is illegal in a lot of places like China,
yeah.
Nigeria for certain capital controls. But for us, it's like sending 60,000 across the world makes sense.
Mhm.
Question though, when you talked about Bitcoin ETFs, where are you with the Bitcoin ETFs versus like, hey, the decentralized nature, the ethos from Satoshi Nakamoto? Bitcoin ETFs are just kind of like traditional products where we're kind of pretending that we're touching Bitcoin, but not exactly. Are Bitcoin ETFs
Yeah.
good to get people onboarded into crypto and now they can venture off into Web3 and DeFi? Or is it bad because we're not even touching the underlying asset?
That's I'm genuinely slightly, baffled by the Bitcoin ETFs and what impact it actually has. I guess it brings institutional money to the table. It does notionally prop up the value of Bitcoin, and the people who are going to benefit from this, if the investment is a positive one, will be people that are already wealthy that will then have the added layer of consumer protection if anything goes wrong with with BlackRock, for instance. So you'll have people who are already wealthy having better customer protection than people who are just buying into it. At the same time, it also seems confusing. It doesn't really seem to sit with the whole not your keys, not your crypto kind of
Right.
thing, right? So I I don't really know what it means. I mean, you look at who holds crypto now, who holds Bitcoin, sorry. If you look at the ownership, I think BlackRock are one of the biggest, they're one of the top 10 holders of Bitcoin in the world, right? So are Fidelity, so is the US government, so is the Chinese government. And that is materially important in terms of decentralization. It doesn't do anything to eradicate the technological properties of Bitcoin and your ability to have self custody and to own your own assets. But I do think the idea of a decentralized economy where you've got huge wealth inequality and wealth held by a small number of people does limit the kind of revolutionary power of the whole thing. And it also gives people less incentive to get involved. I mean, there's only so many more multiples that Bitcoin can go up in price, for instance. So it's a lure to someone who doesn't have a huge amount of money might kind of diminish at this point. Yeah, it's at the same time, I'm talking about the wealth inequalities. In many respects, that horse has bolted for Bitcoin. Same for Ether, and I know there's ETFs being launched for that as well. So yeah, I wouldn't say that these things kill the idea of decentralization, but I think they highlight that this isn't Bitcoin isn't really a wealth distribution tool in the way that people thought it might be. Yeah, it doesn't
Well,
completely stop the
I'm
party there.
curious, what would you take from the, you've been in the traditional finance space,
Yeah.
you've read about it, you've been having probably one of the people that has the most conversations with people that are interacting with traditional investment methods. What's something that you wish you could plug in from the TradFi space into crypto for any reason, whether it's security, governance, is there anything you're like, hey, why can't we just absorb this? They're doing this so right. They do a lot of things wrong, but this is one
Yeah.
thing they're doing right that we need in crypto in order to kind of get the same momentum and user adoption?
It's a difficult question to answer because part of the beauty of Bitcoin is its lack of governance. Almost the fact that is a property of the thing. That is kind of what makes it. At the same time, I think the lack of consumer protection is something that bothers me a bit about crypto, and I don't know how you could ever provide it really without, because again, it's easy to regulate entities and centralized exchanges and so on, but regulating everyone that comes into contact with like a decentralized exchange is incredibly difficult. But I think you have a situation where people come to the table, like most users of DeFi are qualified financial professionals who have some background in tech or finance, generally quite well read, relatively affluent. And then you get new people coming to the table that perhaps don't know a huge amount about finance, maybe have read some blogs somewhere that say that a coin's going to the moon. And they're kind of easy to fleece, I would imagine, if I'm coming at this from the perspective of a scammer or someone who's got slightly less than virtuous intentions. So I would like to see more protection for people that come into the space, because if, I don't think crypto has to be a scam, but if I was going to scam, it's pretty handy for that. So I would like to see that brought in, but I have no genuinely good ideas on how to do that.
It's interesting. I've been talking to so many different companies. They offer like wallet warranty. There's a couple DeFi insurance companies. Do you believe that, because you talked about, in the sense of, big institutions, the only way they can touch DeFi is if they have compliant measures. Do you just feel like there should be a toggle? Like, hey, if I want to go into DeFi and I want to play, that's cool, but I should be able to toggle KYC, AML for certain issues. Is that what some of these DeFi projects should be doing? Is allowing an access point, similar to how a lot of these
Mhm.
centralized exchanges have DeFi or decentralized exchanges infrastructures that people can port out to and go into at their leisure. Do you think DeFi kind of has to have that same kind of on ramp from the centralized point to touch the technology?
It's interesting because I think once you bring in that kind of layer of verification and ID, you lose that notional inclusion aspect of DeFi, which is that anyone can use it, regardless of their circumstance. It also, creates an audit trail that some people probably don't want. It's, I guess sometimes there's no benefit without also sacrificing something, and that's the situation you have with DeFi. So I don't know. I mean, you're then looking at a system that more closely resembles the regulated industry too, and a toggle for people saying, I opt in or I opt out. Yeah, I mean, that's tricky as well, because I think if you look at investment from an investment sense and have this notion of a sophisticated investor, I know that's certainly a thing in the UK. I'm not sure if you have it by a different name in the US, but if you're trying to invest in more exotic things and more alternative assets, and you're insisting that you're wanting to do it, and you've got an advisor or a wealth manager, you often need to prove that the investor is a sophisticated investor. How you would prove that in DeFi, I don't know. I'm not sure the certificates are there to do that. Yeah, I don't know where the bar is
That's
for
an
that.
interesting point. I think in the States, I think they have it. I don't even think it's for exotic. It's for any, investments. You have to be an accredited investor. I think,
Yeah.
proven net worth or funds or assets over $1 million,
Well,
I
yeah,
believe.
actually, come to think about it, I think if you've got an advisor over here, you generally, if you're doing something that your advisor says you probably shouldn't do, then that's the bar, I think. But I'm sure someone in the comments could probably correct me on that one. It's been a
So there
while.
you
It's been a few
go.
years since I was doing that every day.
You wrote a blog on, and we talked about earlier about the impact of crypto in the elections. We're obviously seeing this in the US, but this is an election year across. I think this is the most global elections we've ever had, where the most countries we've ever had have significant elections this year.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts? We see, I think now some of Kamala Harris's representatives are now talking a lot of more about crypto, even though they were
Yeah.
quite critical about it before. Is this a big play? And then the second follow-up question is like, why are we going after the crypto community that's usually very anti, government and governance,
Huh.
and they're more libertarian than the average person? Does does it make sense for these governments to even pitch, Trump at Bitcoin National? Does it make sense for these candidates to be pitching a community that, technically I don't know would be, that invested in the presidential and voting process to begin with? And I could be
Yeah.
wrong in saying that, but that's just, that is the
No, it's
antithesis
a really
of
reasonable
Bitcoin.
question, and this year seems very different to other years. I mean, as you say, I've written a blog on this. I've got a blog that I occasionally write called New Adventures in DeFi, which covers kind of topical issues. I try and keep it lighthearted and end up going on lengthy kind of investigations of things. And yeah, one of the things, like the American election is fascinating from the other side of the pond. I do think it makes sense for people to chase it, both Trump and Harris. One, it seems to fit more neatly with a Republican kind of free market narrative and libertarian kind of streak, as you highlight. There is definite support, I think, within that Bitcoin community for Trump. But I think the other thing, a lot of people have invested a lot of time and money into businesses and into cryptocurrencies, and probably want reassurances that their money won't be touched. And to a lot of people, a government that was trying to interfere with that would be an invasion of their rights, of their freedom, and that becomes very important to people. So I think when you consider, I think it's 7% of the American population, I think, own or traded crypto last year. In an election won by fine margins, it makes sense for them to pursue this. I think the interesting thing is, again, the blog, I kind of go into the various policies that are set out by Trump and kind of analyze them. Some of them are quite sensible. Some of them have come from research positions. Others are wild, and I think he's just said them in the heat of the moment, like freeing Ross Ulbricht, for instance. Like, we know Trump gets carried away when he talks about stuff, right? So when he says stuff like that, that's not a serious policy, is it? But anyway, the key thing he's trying to say is vote for me, isn't it? I'm not going to take your crypto away. I'm not going to shut down your businesses. I'm going to try and, yeah. But he's also receiving funding from crypto companies too. Always be aware of where you're, it doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong necessarily, but always be aware of what your politicians are getting funded by. And someone who's previously not liked crypto and said it's not real money, who now suddenly likes crypto and is receiving funding from crypto companies, and also is after votes in a marginal election. I mean, make of that what you will. Harris, similarly, though, I mean, as you say, the Democrats haven't been. I can't say they don't love crypto, do they? They've not loved crypto as far as I'm aware. But that is also to kind of paint that as a blanket statement. There are Democrats that are pro crypto. There's also in the Republican Party pro and anti crypto representatives across the board. I think for Kamala, what's interesting is she's taken the more sensible and considered approach to this policy stuff right now, which is to speak to the likes of Ripple and Circle and Coinbase. Well, that's been reported anyway, to try and come up with some sensible policy decisions. I think she probably needs to say something at some point soon to give some reassurances. But I think the other thing here is we're looking at crypto as in like crypto good or crypto bad. And the whole conversation around crypto and around DeFi is just so broken, because it's not a bipartisan issue. It shouldn't be something that is, I'm left wing or I'm right wing, and therefore I think X or Y about crypto. And then beyond that, I mean, and again, I explore this in the book in a small amount of detail. There are certain cryptocurrencies that are owned primarily by left wing people, like Ether, I think, or others by right wing and libertarians. I think Dash meets that criteria. And then if you look at like anarcho capitalists, for instance, there's like over a third of, I think, Monero holders identify as anarcho-capitalists, which is like there's kind of a crypto for everyone, is what I'm trying to say. And to kind of paint this thing as in the way that it's being painted is slightly wrong. And then to say, crypto good or crypto bad, like, am I talking about stable coins? Am I talking about meme coins? Am I talking about Bitcoin? Am I talking about decentralized exchanges? There's a million and one different angles to it. And my hope is that a better conversation could emerge. It's a very faint hope, and that we could actually apply some nuance to the situation, because the regulation of crypto shouldn't be as simple as vote for me and I'll make it easy, or vote for me and I'll shut it down. It shouldn't be that conversation. But anyway, I think it's fascinating to see how that's playing out. And I'm intrigued to see what Kamala says next, because she is clearly putting some thought and effort, and her team is clearly looking into this before coming out with some kind of position on it.
A win for the industry, right? If they're both talking about crypto, then that's good, because we're gonna have to come to some kind of collaboration at some point. It's not going to be one party or the other that's going to drive this. We need them both to say, okay, it's good, but with some guardrails. Let's put in those guardrails. Now, you have a podcast too with Sherry Chen, Mickey Tatspe, and others. you're interviewing the leaders of the space, and there's one more person. I believe it's Rachel Morrissey. So I don't want to leave
Correct.
anybody out.
Yes.
Were there any episodes that stood out to you? Because you've been writing this for almost, I believe, or at least Money 2020 has had a version of this for about 6 years. Is there any guests that stood out, whether you were the host at the time or not? You're like, oh, interesting person. Didn't think they would go this route, or oh, didn't think they'd be so lighthearted and funny. I thought they were more serious. Anything that stuck out to you as a podcast host?
Do you know what? I'm one of several hosts on that podcast. As you say, Rachel is the kind of mastermind behind a lot of it. She doesn't like to take credit for it, but she is. She did a fantastic podcast with the guys at Stronghold Mining, talking about how, crypto mining goes on. And it was a proper investigation. She actually went out to their mine. Is it a mine? Would you call it a mine? She went there and visited them and actually spoke to them about it. And that is a really great podcast to check out. I mean, I had a few at Europe this year that I thought were quite fun. I was speaking to Laura Barrowcliff from GBG, who she looks at kind of fraud and identity. And we were talking about how, the rise of AI and the rise of, biometrics is also being matched by a rise in deep fakes and again, people automating their hacks and attacks and scams and all that kind of stuff. So that was fun because we were at the show and she was, saying this could be an industry all of its own. You could actually run an industry event for hackers and scammers. So we started kind of piecing together what Fraud 2020 would look like, and I had a good time with that. That was a really fun episode. And there's been a few others as well. Over in the UK, there was an embedded finance platform, Railser. It was a unicorn valued business, was doing very well. Obviously, COVID, a few other things, overspending, whatever, nearly went bankrupt. And we got to speak to the incoming CEO about how he'd turned that business around, which I thought was quite fascinating, hearing leadership lessons and how you can rescue a fintech that was doing everything right until it suddenly wasn't. And he was, Philippe Morel, the CEO, was very, open about what had to be done, including, layoffs and things like that. That was a really good conversation. And then one that didn't feature me, we had Pav Gill, who's the Wirecard whistleblower, card being, one of Europe's biggest kind of financial scandals of the last few years. Pav was the guy who actually, again, blew the whistle on that. And he was interviewed by Jason Mikula, who some people will know from FinTech Business Weekly, which is a hugely popular FinTech, blog or publication. I don't know what he'd rather call it, but that was a great episode too. So there's loads of stuff going on. And I think what's good is we try and have fun with it. I mean, Cheryl Chen, who you mentioned as well, I love hosting with her because we get silly with it and we try and offer insight, but also have fun. We try and have a bit of personality and a bit of fun, but at the same time, we're speaking to real industry leaders and it's a cool thing to be able to do. So yeah, I don't do all of those podcasts. We rotate it. Obviously, Mickey, who I mentioned earlier, does some great podcasts too. But it's a privilege to be part of that whole series.
That's awesome. We have to catch up the ones that you mentioned, and the incoming CEO one. I always think that's interesting. And I know the GBG team because I'm big on crypto investigations, blockchain investigations, and they're deep in that world as well with their solutions. Did they have the wolf out at your event, or did they not have the wolf costume on you?
They did have the wolf, yeah. They leaned into that as well. I think that's really good fun. I think most shows need people to wear a mascot outfit. It's
yeah. That's definitely catching. In Canada we had it was a fox, I think, the fox with the cane. So that's always good fun. Before we end off, what are your thoughts on some of the things that aren't getting that as much attention? You mentioned in the book NFTs, the Metaverse. Where are we with those? Is the technology still sound, but we're just not at the right, point of the cycle where it's like, oh, it's level set, right? There's no real hype. It's just, it's just the technology and the use cases. What are your thoughts on the Metaverse and NFTs?
Yeah, the Metaverse. We don't talk about that anymore, do we? I think it's really interesting because a lot of the problems that we look at, and the same is true of crypto. I think people find technology or they create tech solutions and they think that that's the job done. And when it comes to the proliferation of tech and mass adoption of tech, so many of the problems that we encounter are not tech problems. And I think the Metaverse kind of run into that. So, I think this might not be a popular take, but I personally think the Metaverse will come back in a big way. I don't know when, though. I think the hype came too soon. I don't think the access to the technology was ready. I don't think the experience was ready either.
I think the timing too, right? Right after the pandemic, all we wanted to do was go touch somebody. Everybody.
Well, yeah. Even touch grass, like anything, like anything.
Like, the last thing you want to do is go back into a virtual world.
Yeah, honestly, I think there was probably that slight kind of hold up of people that really enjoyed the pandemic and maybe still didn't want to leave their houses, who possibly like the Metaverse. But no, I think it was, people were trying to do too much and the need wasn't there. And it might have seen a better idea during a lockdown when, you can't speak to the people who you care about, but then you could again. So do I need to wear a headset to do that? And would I not, as you say, I'd rather just do it in person and see people in real life, which I think we usually would. I mean, we're human, but I think, again, some of the projections got out of hand. This idea that we'd all spend hours a day in the metaverse, it just doesn't really fit. But I do see a future for it. As I say, I actually am still quite bullish on the idea of it, but I'd expect kind of pockets of use cases to emerge, and then maybe more after that. But the idea of a big blanket experience that we're all experiencing simultaneously, I think the energy that requires actually is actually a big problem anyway. Never mind the fact that it's not necessarily going to scale socially. So I think, yeah, maybe small and contained use cases for specific businesses, arts and entertainment, stuff like that. Then maybe think about joining the dots and having a bigger international community that engages regularly on a metaverse. I think
Or
it could
like
happen.
everyday use cases. Like I wouldn't mind putting on, the goggles if I'm buying a new condo or a new house and I
Yeah.
have the floor plans and I want to know like, hey, how big is this room in real
Yeah.
life versus on paper? I think that's a use case people would like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's just getting to that point. I mean, I think the other thing as well is like the business aspect of it. And the market needs to follow the money. Those use cases, there's use cases that are cool and there's use cases that have a business case. I think the metaverse needs to follow those first and maybe focus on those people that have money to spend, who will spend the money, and then grow from there. Because until you're making money, you can't really scale. I mean, I know Meta have tried throwing billions after billions at it. Very few companies are able to do that.
Yeah, they seem like they backed off and they're going, they're
Mhm.
doubling down now into AI. And they'll probably incorporate it again soon, but like it seems
Yeah,
like they're doubling down on AI. What's,
yeah.
speaking of AI, and I don't want you to talk about AI, what's one thing you're like, oh man, I didn't get a chance. There's that 3 months probably from the time you stop writing the book till it's published. I don't know how long. Maybe you can educate us. What's one thing that you left out? That like Bitcoin, DeFi on Bitcoin is probably a major one. I'm not sure if you captured it in the book. But what's something you're
Yeah.
like, oh man, why didn't I know about this, 2 weeks ago so I could have squeezed it into a chapter?
I think actually it's an ongoing story, and you're right. DeFi on Bitcoin is a good one to add in because there was that distinction between it's Bitcoin, it's not really DeFi, whereas now does it really matter? I mean, there's other things as well. Actually, I think more recently, I don't think there's any mass scaled solution yet, but I've seen kind of ideas that you can basically embed payment services into crypto wallets. So then you get when you're trying to buy something, you can notionally buy basic everyday items with cryptocurrency because a service provider will basically make that exchange for you. The merchant receives fiat currency, you spend crypto, there's an exchange that happens. I don't know if that actually fully works just yet, but I find that area interesting. If someone finds a way to make it really easy to spend crypto on a daily basis, that could have interesting impacts on the market.
Episodes coming up on the podcast where we recorded about crypto debit and credit cards are gaining a lot of popularity. So you have
Yeah.
to listen out to those for the
So yeah,
listeners.
I will do. I just want to see where that's going and how they work in practice, because if that is something that you can suddenly do, that changes things. But again, I think it is just this ongoing story. I mean, I was writing about CBDCs in the book, for instance, and that's an ongoing adventure and
Yeah.
exploration. Different banks are taking different approaches to it, and we're still finding out what people are going to do with those CBDCs. Obviously, a lot of people are terrified about what they may or may not be. The people I've spoken to who are building them are generally saying sensible things, but I think it's the concern about what they might be that terrifies people. Yeah, I'd love to kind of provide updates on that. I think another thing is, again, the role of crypto in politics. You've got the idea of a Bitcoin reserve being floated. You've got nations like El Salvador being further along in its crypto journey. Other nations looking to kind of copy. I know in Argentina, Milei said some interesting things about Bitcoin. I think the story just continues. It doesn't end. There's also the impact of regulation. I mean, I've outlined MiCA in Europe and what that might mean for service providers, but that'll evolve, right? I think that will all change. I mean, at the moment, there's no provision in MiCA for DeFi because there's no obvious businesses that it can regulate. But I wonder how long regulators are happy with that kind of, malaise. It's not really a comfortable situation if you're a regulator. So, I mean, a million and one things. Like, I don't think this story has run its course. I think DeFi continues to be interesting, and also its infiltration into regular assets, like regular traditional financial assets, is massive. I mean, Citibank of all people have published a very interesting paper on tokenized assets, which is a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity in there by their reckoning. And when you look at the idea that you could add asset ownership onto tokenized rails, making it more efficient, transparent, and so on, or fractionalized, you could do fun stuff with it. Then, yeah, I mean,
Sounds like you gotta get off this podcast and get back into into the basement or something. Get your pen and paper out.
It might as well
You're
be a
wasting your
basement,
time
seriously.
talking to me.
Honest to goodness, that's the thing. And that was the challenge writing the book, right? Trying to write things on this topic and being dedicated to keeping it accurate is very difficult, and that was always a challenge I set myself. And I think I did a good job of that. But it never ends.
That's amazing. Ian, we're gonna have to end though right here and
What
give you
a
back.
segue. Yes.
Maybe went over by a couple minutes, but tell people where's the best way to reach you. I know LinkedIn's the best for me. Are you knee deep in crypto Twitter, or do you try to stay away from that to keep your creative juices flowing?
Oh, I am very much not active on crypto Twitter. That is, when I was talking about not being able to understand what the hell goes on, that's crypto Twitter. That is a confusing place. Get me on LinkedIn. The name's Ian Horne. I will reach out to, I'll gladly connect with anyone with an interest in crypto and DeFi.
And that's awesome. And hopefully some of our, listeners will, meet up with you at Money 2020 next year in June in beautiful Amsterdam. And instead of sorting side events, they'll come into the actual event.
Pay for a ticket.
Instead of inviting you to the local Starbucks,
now.
They'll come shake your hand.
And come to Vegas. I'll be at Vegas and Bangkok too. So around the world, come to Money 2020, come to the real show. And thanks, Stephen.
Awesome.